Hello, my name is Josh McGrath. I'm the Soil Fertility Extension Specialist at the University of Kentucky in Lexington. Today I'm going to talk to you about soil sampling for precision nutrient management. Soil testing is actually four separate activities. First, we have soil sampling. That's collecting the soil from the field. And traditionally, when we were practicing conventional agriculture, we viewed this as the limiting function, mainly because we weren't covering that field adequately to get the field variability all included in the average. When we're planning to do variable rate, we often grid sample and interpolate between the points. And that's what we're going to spend a fair amount of time talking about during this presentation. I won't be covering soil analysis, which is the second step when you send the soil off to the lab, because in general, we're pretty good at soil testing, soil analysis. The last two steps, interpretation of the results and recommendations, are based on correlation and calibration. And I'm going to spend a fair amount of time talking about this during this presentation because we have a long way to go here when it comes to site-specific management or precision agriculture. So before we talk about soil sampling, let's start at the end and work our way back. Let's cover that interpretation and making the recommendations based on data coming to us from the lab so that we have a firm understanding of the basics before we get into the soil sample collection. So soil test interpretation and fertilizer recommendations are based on two procedures. First, correlation. Correlation is when you determine the relative yield versus the soil test value. So if we look at this figure here on the right, we see the soil test result on the horizontal axis, and it doesn't matter what the units are or what the element is. We can assume this is soil test phosphorus and just relative units, and then relative yield. So it's important to understand how we calculate relative yield. We take a check plot that was not fertilized, and we divide that yield by a plot that got a sufficient or adequate amount of fertilizer. So in this case, phosphorus. Maybe we put down 100 pounds of P2O5 on this plot, 0 pounds on this plot. And perhaps at a soil test of 20, the yield of the sufficient plot was 200 bushels of corn per acre, and the check plot was 100 bushels of corn per acre. And so the relative yield was 0.5 or 50%. And so we do this at multiple sites so that we have a wide range of soil test values in our data set. We plot these relative yields versus soil test. We look for the point where on average relative yield is at 0.95 or better, so 95% relative yield. And we call that the critical soil test concentration. Really, it's a range because there's a ton of variability in this data. At any given point, you can get a large range of relative yields. But on average, above that critical concentration, we don't expect response to fertilizer. And at a soil test below that, we do. So what's calibration? Calibration is the next step. In this case, instead of just needing a sufficient rate and a zero rate, you need to apply multiple rates of fertilizer at one site or one soil test value. In this example, we have a soil test value of 10, 20, and 30. So 10, 20, and 30. And we see that we can get to the same yield endpoint regardless of the soil test. But it takes more fertilizer to get there. So at the soil test of 10, we needed about 125, let's say. And at the soil test of 30, we only needed about 50 pounds of fertilizer to get to the maximum yield. And so we conduct this at multiple sites to get these multiple soil test values. We put in 4 or 5, maybe even 7 rates of fertilizer at each site. And this is how we build those recommendations. But it's not the last step because fertilization philosophy comes to play in taking that correlation data, that calibration data, and making that final recommendation. So what is soil test philosophy? There are 3 kind of main fertilizer philosophies, really 2: sufficiency, build and maintain, and then the third is a hybrid approach between those two. With sufficiency, we say when soil test level is below the optimum or that critical level, we will only apply the amount of nutrients needed to meet the crop needs. And basically, we're saying only apply the yield maximizing rate. What rate is required to maximize yield? And so in its purest sense, we can pull that information directly from this calibration data. This soil test on average, what was the rate required to maximize yield? And, nobody really uses a pure sufficiency approach because there's so much variability in a field. And there's also a variability in the amount of response. One site, when the soil test is 10, may need a lot of fertilizer, and another site, soil test of 10, needs no fertilizer. And then lastly, a lot of the pure sufficiency data has been lost over time. Build and maintain says that you want to rapidly build low soil test concentrations to the optimum level. The hope here is that someday you can stop fertilizing that field. In pure build and maintain, you always replace nutrients removed by the crop, no matter how high soil test levels get. And so we get way out here on the soil test scale, and we know we won't get any more yield for that fertilizer, but we're still adding a maintenance rate in pure build and maintain. So this hybrid approach kind of tries to find the middle ground. We have some build and maintenance to offset our uncertainty in what the exact sufficiency rate is, but we're not getting carried away with the total amount of buildup at the low end needed to drive soil test up. And I'll talk about that in a second because we've got to think about soil buffer capacity as well. Also, in this hybrid approach, we eventually go to zero. Hardly anyone is going to make a fertilizer recommendation when soil test levels are extremely high because that economically just does not pay off. You may be asking about what about base cation saturation ratio, or BCSR. This is the theory that started in the 20s, has a lot of adherents today that really believe it's true, that there's an ideal soil cation ratio of calcium, magnesium, potassium, and that you should fertilize in an effort to get this balance between the cations. It has been disproven by science. Even the people that originally worked on this concept and some graduate students of the people that came up with this back in the 20s have done follow-up studies and found out that it was wrong, that they weren't correcting for pH in their research, and that there's no scientific evidence that BCSR is a way that we should manage fertilizer. So we're not going to talk any more about it other than it absolutely has no place in modern agriculture. So, we went over that sufficiency only recommendations are that yield maximizing rate, but we have trouble identifying what that is because that data wasn't captured. I will say that there's a national effort in the United States led by universities here in the Southeast to put together a database and a user interface so that you can look at the actual correlation and calibration data and go back and find out what the sufficiency rates are from that original data set. This is the University of Kentucky recommendations. You can see they're much higher than sufficiency. So across this range, we're probably applying way more than what we need to maximize yield. And we go up to about 200 pounds per acre for corn at the lowest soil test range with phosphorus. And that's actually much lower than what would be required to really move soil test a lot. But, it's kind of a hybrid. When we see other recommendations from other sources, either other universities, University of Tennessee, or from the private sector soil test labs that are higher, it's not because they're using different correlation or calibration data. They're probably using that same information that was generated years ago at the universities. It's because they're adhering to a different philosophy, perhaps adding a little bit more of an insurance factor on top of these recommendations. So you see that we go up past our determined critical level, but then we eventually go to zero at 60 pounds per acre soil test P, or 30 parts per million. And, a sufficiency rate would go to zero right at that critical level. So what is this kind of buffer capacity and how does it factor in all this? This data from Tom and Dollarhide shows that how much in pounds of soil P2O5 added are required to change soil test 1 unit. So at the University of Kentucky, our soil test is provided in pounds per acre. So for phosphorus, it's pounds per acre of phosphorus. And depending on where you start at, that initial soil test P, it's a nonlinear function. And at very low soil tests, you need a lot more fertilizer to move soil test 1 unit than at a higher soil test. And what they found is that low soil tests, down in this range, it required about 10 to 25 pounds of P2O5 per acre, so from 10 to 25 pounds of P2O5 per acre to change soil test 1 unit. Once we got up to the optimum range or above, we typically required less than 5 pounds per acre to move 1 unit. And so you can pour a lot of phosphorus on a very low soil and see very little change. So what does this mean relative to our recommendations? Well, in this figure, the blue line indicates the amount of fertilizer in pounds of P2O5 per acre required to move soil test 10 units. Soil test phosphorus we're talking about here. So 10 pounds per acre of soil test phosphorus change. And so the University of Kentucky at 5 parts per million soil test phosphorus, or excuse me, 5 pounds per acre of soil test phosphorus will recommend 200 pounds per acre of P2O5 on a corn crop. But in fact, you would need much more than that, going up to 500 or 600 pounds per acre of phosphorus to move 10 parts. And this is why, even if you follow university recommendations for the highest rate, 200 or even 300 pounds per acre, you would see very little change over time in these low testing soils. So when we think about precision ag, this is where we start talking about precision ag. If you believe in build and maintain, it doesn't really have a place in precision ag because you're pouring a lot of phosphorus with little change and it's well above the rate that maximizes yield. If precision ag is all about being precise. And so down at this low soil test, you probably need less than 100 pounds of P2O5 per acre to maximize yield. So the additional 100, if you're using university recommendations, is wasted money. You're not getting additional yield this year from that. You say, well, I'm bankrolling it for the future. The problem is soils don't pay interest. You're better off putting that money in a savings account, even with the pitiful interest rates we have right now. And that's all because of this buffer capacity. Soil phosphorus or potassium is like an iceberg. The soil test extracts from these discrete, pools, minerals, organic matter, exchangeable nutrients. And so that's the tip of this iceberg that we see in our soil test. And the crop takes a very little piece of that. And when it does, that iceberg floats up. And so that's why the sufficiency rate is actually lower in most cases than the crop removal rate. Because when the crop removes some nutrient, that soil, that iceberg floats up, and that soil is going to feed the plant available pool with these long and short-term storage pools. Is it great to mine a soil for all the nutrients that's low? No, of course not. At the very low level, you don't want to be mining too much. But from an economic and precision ag standpoint, philosophically, again, this is where we get into philosophy, not hard science, you may be better off frequently soil testing and applying closer to that sufficiency rate, letting the soil supply some of the nutrient that's needed, and just applying that yield maximizing rate, but coming back every year with it. So frequent soil testing, frequent fertilization versus applying once every 3 years. Since sufficiency is probably less than crop removal, from a philosophical standpoint, the right thing to do with precision ag might be to fall somewhere in between sufficiency and crop removal. Of course, this is somewhat of a moot argument since we don't have publicly available data on what the sufficiency rate is. Again, like I said, we're working to correct that. And currently here at the University of Kentucky, we're doing a lot of research on calibrating precision recommendations, which would be different than conventional recommendations, which is mostly what precision ag does now, is we take recommendations that were built from the ground up for a flat rate system, and we're trying to put that round peg in a square hole with precision ag. Nonetheless, if you're practicing precision ag, you might want to think, if you're in the low soil test range at least, kind of dropping down a little bit towards at least crop removal or doing a little research on what the right sufficiency rate is. Maybe even using your equipment to do some on-farm testing to find rates that work in your precision setup. So you're probably more confused than when we started with that introduction to interpretation and making recommendations. It's not cut and dry when you get into precision ag. And if you have more questions, my email address will be at the end of the presentation here. Feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to sit there and chew on this with you a little bit. I could probably learn more from you than you could learn from me, but I'm always happy to talk. Let's talk about collecting those soil samples, though, for precision ag. Precision ag attempts to break a field into smaller management zones. I think most precision ag uses grid sampling. There's two types of grid sampling, grid point, and I think this is the most common method used, but also grid cell. And so typically we're going to interpolate grid point data. Grid sampling does a really good job of identifying when the variability comes from previous management. Examples are combining small fields into a larger field. Let's say there was a tobacco patch back in this old part of the field. And so, you might have really high soil test P where that tobacco patch used to be. And maybe over here there was an old farmstead. And so historically there was some manure applied there, and so soil test P is higher. Maybe there's some striping from fertilizer application in this field. Grid sampling has a better chance of finding management-derived variability. Directed sampling, more commonly referred to as zone management, is directing the soil sampling to these zones and trying to get an average for the zone. So when you do directed sampling, you need other data, yield maps, remote sense images, elevation, slope, topography data, maybe soil texture from EC, apparent electrical conductivity like a Varus map. Maybe you've got some grid soil data that you can throw in here, or just web soil surveys, Sergo maps. But it also requires experience with the field. When you do zone delineation, you need to understand how all of these variables these layers of data that you're stacking to look at, how do they interact and how do they actually express and yield out in the field? So you got to have user experience. It's not easy. And also, it has to be done on a field by field basis. There's not a way to kind of do zones across all of your fields at once. So it's labor intensive. This is why grid sampling is so popular. It's the easy button. I can take software, overlay a 2-acre grid on a field or all of my fields. I can send a kid out with a hydraulic soil probe that can take 300 samples a day and get this grid data in. But there are some problems. I believe that the scientific literature shows we've been led astray by grid sampling for precision ag. So there's this paper. I strongly recommend you looking it up by Lauzon et al. It's published in 2005. Other people have duplicated this information since then. And it shows that interpolation doesn't really work for precision ag. So what do you do when you interpolate? You're estimating an unknown value between two sample points. So let's go back and look at this previous figure. So when we go back and look at this figure, we can see that with interpolation, let's say we're trying to identify what is the value here at this point where we didn't sample. Let's say this is a 2-acre grid. And there's random variability. We call it stochastic variability in soil test values. And so you're going along collecting samples 10, 13, 11, 22, 18, 13 parts per million phosphorus. And then you hit this one point, it's 45 parts per million phosphorus. Well, that's a really high point. It's a real value. For some reason, there's a high spot here. And then you've got 7, 12, 9, 15. Another high one, 35. 22 is a little high, 11, 13, 10. And if we averaged this whole field together, we'd get around 17 parts per million. But when you interpolate, it weights the points closest to your unknown value more, because one of the basic premises of spatial statistics is that things that are close together are more alike than things that are far apart. But the problem is they have to be close enough together for that law to hold up. And there's ways we can determine how close is close enough. Unfortunately, when we grid point sample, we rather arbitrarily pick 2.5 acres per grid or 2 acres per grid. Or if you're really, a go-getter, maybe you're doing 1-acre grids. That seems really tight. It turns out that's not good enough because soil properties have high stochastic variability. Lots of these points that are outliers. And so when we interpolate this, the interpolation procedure might predict a value here of 25 or 30 because of this high point. And really, maybe it should be down around the field average of 17. More than likely, because there's some other low points around here, it might even be down around 12. And so this is where interpolation goes wrong. And this paper from Lauzon lays it out pretty well. Samples must be collected close enough that they are correlated with an R value of greater than 0.3. So this is a statistical procedure that we never do. And what they found was that on average, when they looked at a lot of fields, to get to the R value of 0.3, the separation distance required was 30 meters, which is a quarter acre. Separation distance is the distance between 2 points that are actually sampled. So if you have been sampling coarser than a quarter acre, so 1 acre, 2 acre, 2.5 acre grids, then you can't interpolate. The interpolated map has very little meaning. The grid data is still good. You can use summary statistics from your grid data, but you shouldn't interpolate that grid data to come up with a map. Other people have duplicated this. Here's a map from a friend of mine at Penn State, John Spargo, who runs the soil testing lab up there. And what we find is, because at the small scale soil properties have this stochastic random variation, on average, the estimated values are right. But at each spot, interpolation is further off than the field average. What's that mean? It means that in this example, if we went back and we just did an average of our grid data, it would be closer to the true value if I went back in here and actually collected a sample to see what it was. The field average, 95% of the time, is closer to that unknown value than the interpolated prediction. 95% of the time, the field value will be better. The field average will be better. So interpolation of grid sample data does not work when it's sampled greater than 1/4 acre. And this has to do with the difference between accuracy and precision. Basically, on average, something that's accurate is right, but wrong every single time. And that's what we see with precision ag over and over again. So what are some sampling strategies that you can use? Well, let's start with a soil map. This is off a web soil survey. You can go in there and look at the soil classification, the map units, and get information on soil depth. It's pretty coarse data, but it tells you kind of something about the texture, the drainage, and the soil depth. And this is, basically soil properties control yield response to nutrients, and nutrient availability. So this is a great starting point, even though it's pretty coarse. You can maybe do a little better getting apparent electrical conductivity that I mentioned earlier. So there are devices like Dulum or Varus, and there's some other machines on the market that give you apparent electrical conductivity that correlates well with soil texture. And so you can take that map that has a little bit better spatial precision and you bring it into a software package and maybe start to develop an intensively sampled zone. So this directed sampling concept. I personally think that because soil map units correlate very well with topography, so slope, aspect, and elevation, and that slope and elevation combined are important because you can have a flat slope at the top of a hill and a flat slope at the bottom of the hill, but they can behave very differently. And so you might want to use topography, that soil texture from, say, your Varus map. Maybe you have historic grid sample data. You can bring that in and bring it into a statistical package that looks through these layers. So it looks at slope and aspect and elevation and texture and even the soil map from Web Soil Survey. And it drills through there and looks for relationships of when these factors are moving together and then breaks it up into zones. You notice I didn't mention using yield to create this zone. I know this is probably the most common method that people use to make zones because it seems intuitive, but think about it this way. You're using yield to make a zone. that determines a nutrient application that then influences yield. So it becomes circular. Do you apply the highest rate to the lowest yielding area? Well, then your good yielding ground might be getting shorted and it has the highest removal. Or do you use a removal map? So you take your yield and you multiply it by removal and apply that rate. Well, maybe the low yielding area is doing poorly because it needs more phosphorus or potassium or whatever you're working with. So it becomes very circular. I think it's better to use these properties that control yield, like topography and soil texture, and then use yield to test your zones. Because remember, I said you have to look at those zones and make, do they make sense? And so yield's a good way. Lay that yield map over top of your zone and say, does this make sense? And then go in and soil sample within those zones, collect a lot of samples. You want to have dense sampling with automated soil probes. This becomes a lot easier, and you can go out there and take 20, 30, 40 cores, put them in the bucket, mix them up to generate that soil sample that goes off to the lab. We've been using MZA, or Management Zone Analyst, as our software because it's just a statistical package that we can put multiple layers of data in. It drills through them, looks for the relationships, and it gives you statistical output to tell you how many zones is optimal. This website provides some basic information on the software package. It's developed some time ago, so it's kind of a little wonky software. Some of these calculations may have been wrapped up into commercial packages that develop zones, but it's hard to tell because apparently, obviously they're not transparent about what calculations are going on in the background when you click around in a commercial software. Whereas with MZA, you can go to their documentation, you know exactly what's happening. We are working on some tutorial videos where we show how to use different data layers to develop zones, and then we'll show how these zones interact with average soil testing. This work is being funded by the Kentucky Small Grain Growers Association. Very appreciative of that funding. It's allowing us to go out and collect some really dense samples on 1/10 of an acre grid so that we can evaluate zones that are developed using topography and soil texture. We're hoping by the end of the year to start putting some very brief, 5-minute tutorial videos online that you go through a series of the videos using free software you can download online. And that way you learn the theory and philosophy behind how to do this. And then you can go back to your commercial package and kind of do the same thing. So here's a simple example. So we took elevation and slope for the field that I showed from that soil test map previously. So this is this field here, and we basically took the slope and elevation, we ran it through MZA, and MZA said, okay, you need 4 zones, and then we're going to go and we're going to drop a grid on top of that because we had some grid data for that field, and I'm going to take all the points that fell within those zones, and I'm going to average them. I'm also going to take the median, and I'm going to take the standard deviation, and that way I can learn if that zone has a lot of variation in it, which means maybe I need to either offset my risk of that variation, or maybe I need to split that zone up some more. And, then I'm going to look at the central tendency of that zone with the mean and the median, and then figure out what fertilizer rate I'm going to apply. And so this is just one approach for collecting samples. If you don't already have that grid data, you can go in there after MZA delineates your zones and drive your 4-wheeler across there, have that zone up on a tablet with your GIS software, and collect 20 or 30 cores here. And even though this is zone 3 as well, it's a separate field, so I'll probably do 20 or 30 cores there. Zone 1's pretty small, so maybe I don't need that density, but I'm going to get a lot of cores, put them in the bucket, mix them up, and send them off to the lab. And then, I'm going to try and make an intelligent decision about the rate based on, the variability within those zones, what I know about sufficiency rate versus build and maintain, and also my field history. Remember, our precision ag equipment, one of the best advantages that we have with that is the ability to put test strips out. So, you develop this zone approach, you put your prescription in, and then you can layer over top of your prescription some strips of a low, medium, and high rate to go across there and kind of test did your prescription work. So I hope this helped a little bit. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. We're learning a lot of this as we go along. I think, the one piece of advice that you might want to really kind of adhere to is if someone tells you they know everything about precision ag, they're probably feeding you a pile of chicken manure like this, because we're really still learning. Remember, we've been using conventional recommendations that are shoehorned into precision settings. So, I think discussing this and thinking through these things might help us kind of do better. So here's my contact information. If you have any questions, again, feel free to reach out. Thank you.